Good morning, everybody. It's really great to see everybody. Thanks for joining us, especially this morning. I know it's a really busy time of the semester here at ASU, so it's great to see so many friends and great also to have an opportunity this morning to really engage in a conversation with some amazing folks about what this challenge of what we're calling life after carbon. So this question of what does the post-carbon city look like? This is the third in a series of webinars that we've been doing on this topic through the Center for Energy and Society here at ASU, and really exploring different facets of what it means to think about the future in relationship to a transformation of our infrastructures and, in many respects, our lives that is of the kind of scope and scale and pace of the transition to a carbon neutral future that we're now looking through the tunnel at, so to speak, as the US federal government and other governments around the world begin to mobilize action to transform energy systems in major ways, really to try to limit the damage from climate change. And this morning's webinar, really excited to have our participants here this morning to tackle this challenge of how do we think about futures in ways that really center the people who will be living in those futures. It's quite a difficult challenge. You know, when we think about the city, Lewis Mumford in The City in History argued, and I'll quote, "The chief function of the city is to convert power into form, energy into culture, dead matter into the living symbols of art, biological reproduction into social creativity." He was really arguing that cities are the place where humans take the stuff of life, the world that is around us, and transform it into the highest expressions of human creativity, human culture, human imagination, right? They're the places where humans thrive, where we make our institutions, where we build our monuments, where we create meaning about what human life is about and how we should organize it and to what ends and to what purposes we should put human endeavor. And yet, if you think about the discussions that we have about, let's say, the energy transition or really any kind of future, what we often find is a lot of conversation about technology, right? About the material stuff, the engineered stuff of what that future might look like, but not a lot of engagement or at best a kind of narrow, highly caricaturized vision of what those futures might look like, right? An Apple iPhone commercial type view of what a wondrous life we're all going to live of leisure and friendship and family and all of those wonderful mom and pie things about the future, right? And not really a real sense of what the future will look like. And yet, of course, we all know, right, that the futures that we live today, which are full of traffic jams and giant thoroughfares that run through our cities, full of automobiles that are billowing out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, those are all the products of our technological transformations of the past, right? Of introducing technologies like the automobile into our lives. And so I really think that we need to find new ways to talk about the people of the future to talk about what cities might look like in the future that both celebrate the possibilities, of course, of what we might be able to create in a post-carbon future, but they're also realistic, that grapple with human realities, that grapple with the real social challenges, the inequalities, the injustices of the present, and what those might look like in the future as well. And so I'm super excited today to have four fantastic partners in this conversation today. First, we're going to hear a little bit from Elizabeth Minoyan and Robert Ferry. They are the founding co-directors of the Land Art Generator Initiative, which is an unprecedented, groundbreaking global design competition initiative that really has set a new world standard for the visual imagination of the post-carbon city and the urban future powered by renewable energy. Elizabeth works closely with cities, universities, companies, art organizations, and community groups to design customized approaches to renewable energy installations. And Robert is a registered architect and a LEED accredited professional with 2 decades of professional experience. As second, we have with us Andrew Dana Hudson. He's a speculative fiction writer and a sustainability researcher, and one of the leading new voices exploring the future of solar-powered societies. His writings have explored the urban futures of cities all over the globe, real and imagined, from Detroit, Portland, Miami, and Atlanta to Delhi, Melbourne, and the Arctic. And his award-winning stories have appeared in Slate Future Tense, Lightspeed Magazine, Vice Terraform, MIT Technology Review, Grist, Little Blue Marble, The New Accelerator, and more, demonstrating his ability to cut across these worlds of technology, innovation, science fiction. How do we bring these ideas together? And then finally, we have with us Malka Older. She's a writer, an academic, and an aid worker, and a faculty associate here at the School for the Future of Innovation Society, and also an associate researcher at the Center for the Sociology of Organizations at Sciences Po, which is the leading French science and technology policy research institution. She's the author of the award-winning Sentinel Cycle series, which is a fascinating look into the future of information, cities, organizations, and democracy in a world of microstates. And those books are Infomocracy, Null States, and State Tectonics. And of course, also with me here to help facilitate the conversation this morning is Joey Esrich. Joey is the editor and program manager for the Center for Science and the Imagination. And he's co-edited a number of books of fiction and nonfiction, including Everything Change, an anthology of climate fiction, A Year Without Winter, Visions, Ventures, and Escape Velocities, and Cities of Light, of course, our newest look into the future of post-carbon cities powered by solar energy. So thank you all so much for being here this morning. And we're going to start with Elizabeth and Robert. So if you would like to share your screens, that would be fantastic.
Thank you, Clark. It's really nice to be amongst this group of colleagues and friends, and calling in from Seattle, where you can see the glow of Elliott Bay on our faces. So we want to frame our conversation with imagination. And, you know, we really believe that things won't change if we cannot imagine that change. And you're going to see some work that we've done very briefly over the last decade, as well as some ideas that are being sparked currently.
So we have a lot of big decisions to make, and Clark really framed it well. Over the next 2 decades, we are, if we meet the challenge, and we must meet the challenge, we are going to transform our built environments and our landscapes in ways that we've never done before. When people think about a solar installation, this is perhaps something that might come to mind, just panels, utilitarian design on the ground, surrounded by a chain link fence, maybe some barbed wire to protect it, and some security cameras. And there are a select few places in our landscapes where this might be an appropriate approach to energy landscape design. But we're running out of opportunities for that low-hanging fruit, if you will. And if we're going to be implementing the quantity, and let's just talk about solar for a second, we're going to need 10 to 14 modules per human on average. And of course, higher energy consuming nations like the United States are going to need double or triple that to take our share. And that's going to take a lot of land area. It's going to take not just rooftops, it's going to take spaces between buildings. It's going to take a certain level of creativity, innovation, and imagination to make sure that that deployment is going to be equitable and beautiful in places that it needs to be. And we have to bring as much into the city as we can so that we can preserve the uses of our rural landscapes that we cherish and love. And we can't just paper all of this over with solar panels, of course. So what does that look like? We need to make sure that that every one of these installations in a population center, where they do provide greater resilience and all sorts of benefits to cities, are designed collaboratively with the communities in which they're located, so that the people who live next to these infrastructures for 30 years, life cycle of a solar panel, plus is going to be replaced over time. Basically, we're dedicating these shared land uses to energy for a century or more, and until we crack the fusion nut, which I don't think is going to be anytime soon. But so we need to make sure that we're doing these things in a very intentional way that's going to be equitable for people. But we have a really great opportunity because we're investing trillions of dollars in this, and so it's a really great chance to correct some of the social injustices of the past and do this the right way. The mid-century approach to infrastructure of the 20th century made a lot of mistakes. Neighborhoods were ruined by highways, and we can't do that again.
So what we're asking and positioning to the world is, how can we imagine, collaborate, and take action to make sure that all utility scale solar capacity is equitable, just, and community led. And this means early stages, bringing everyone to the table. So rather than a community group planning something without the voices of surrounding stakeholders, this means bringing everyone early on. What we've been doing for the last decade is asking interdisciplinary and collaborative teams around the world to reimagine energy landscapes as works of art. We've been doing this in partnership with private and public entities, by invitation, cities, art organizations, universities, etc., for places around the world. Those have included a snapshot that you see up on the screen here. So we started our design competitions in 2010 in Dubai and Abu Dhabi because we were living there at the time. We were so happy to see that people responded to our call of reimagining some sites in those landscapes as public art. We followed up in New York City, Fresh Kills Park in 2012, 2014, Copenhagen, Santa Monica, Melbourne, Abu Dhabi, and Fly Ranch. And what you're seeing here is a shift in site typologies. So we're going from urban gateways to a landfill, to a brownfield site, coastal site, a site that's been master planned. And Fly Ranch was a bit unique as that it was 4,000 acres in rural Nevada owned by Burning Man. And in addition to asking teams to reimagine energy infrastructure, we asked teams to imagine utilizing water, shelter, agriculture, regeneration, because currently this is a completely off-grid landscape that Burning Man is hoping to develop some sort of year-round programming. We also hold invited competitions. Glasgow and Willimantic are examples. And we do other projects. But first, we're going to show you just a few examples from the competitions.
So what does it look like when you imagine solar technology, for example, here as a work of civic art? This is solar ecosystem. It is using a polycrystalline module, custom shape, that is golden in its hue. And these are actually off-the-shelf technologies. You can buy a gold solar panel today if you want to. So what we've come to learn through this project and what we've shared with creatives around the world is really the versatility of photovoltaic technology and other renewable energy technologies to become media for creative expression. And this new PV sun would power 100 homes while it's creating this amazing public space. Of course, energy duck is a favorite. Everybody loves a duck. This is actually a battery as well, because it allows itself to lower in the water, and micro turbines create electricity after the sun has just set and the peak demand is rising in the city. It's something called the duck curve, so it teaches the public about that interesting dynamic. And then in the morning, it raises itself up with the first light. Nest is a beautifully designed bifacial solar panel installation with these triangular modules that create this form of a clutch of falcon eggs. That's for Masdar City in Abu Dhabi, celebrating the importance of the falcon to culture and creating these beautiful biomes in the desert. Solar Hourglass is the winner of the 2014 competition for Copenhagen. It's an hourglass to remind us all that there's still time to avert the worst effects of climate change if we can act together. And it uses concentrated solar power technology to power about 1,000 homes with solar energy. It focuses light onto a central parabolic mirror that creates a vertical beam of light, and then in the bottom bowl of the hourglass is a receiver full of salt, which is becoming molten, and then a heat transfer fluid is moved through that, turned to steam to power a turbine. And it's a really beautiful, positive, inspiring message about what life can be like in a world beyond carbon, that moves the conversation towards a positive aspiration, rather than focusing too much on the gloom and doom of climate apocalypse, which has dominated the last decade of conversations, and for good reason. But if we don't give people something to run towards rather than just run away from, we may not be able to meet the political will that we really need to meet. And you want to take this?
Sure. We also really love to engage with local communities. This is an example, two examples from our solar mural artwork programming that we've been developing in San Antonio, Texas, with the great leadership of a woman named Penelope Boyer, who's been on the ground there helping to develop partnerships that might be a little bit harder for us from a distance. And what you see are solar panels with a film applied to the top. This film is developed by a couple of companies. One is on the East Coast US and the other in Europe. And there is a slight efficiency loss, about 2%. But what we really love about this program that we've been working with is that it allows for all of the great impact of mural programs. You know, storytelling and community narrative and people coming together, but with the addition, of course, of kilowatt hours, in this case, feeding to grade school in San Antonio, Texas. And the project that you see with the young people was designed by elders in the community as well as fifth graders after a series of workshops. And then they got to help apply the film and be there for the installation of the project and really engaging with what an energy landscape might be for their community.
And there's no reason that every mural program in every city around the world will not evolve into a solar mural application. The technology exists, and it expands the realm of possibilities. You couldn't just put normal solar panels up here. There'd be too much pushback from the community. So we're expanding the landscapes that are possible through this kind of imagining. And we're also making sure that these kinds of benefits are coming along with the energy landscapes that we develop. There's so many places within a city's boundary that could be ripe opportunities for this kind of creative thinking. And with that, we'll end our little opening, and hopefully that'll be fruit for some conversation. Thanks.
Thanks. We'll turn next to Andrew Dana Hudson. Andrew.
Yeah. So I'm like a little vax symptom today, so I hope that you all will bear with me if my presentation is a little chaotic. But can everyone see this? This nice bit of art? Okay. So I kind of got into this sort of area of exploration by latching onto and being really interested in the development of a sort of new genre of science fiction, both sort of literature and aesthetics, and in some ways kind of like a lifestyle movement called Solarpunk. And so I want to share some of like the most Solarpunk art, and then some not so Solarpunk art that kind of depicts urban environments, and sort of talk about what I think these images are doing, and why it is that so many people look at things like this, and myself included, and feel sort of a visceral, like, I want to be there. Like, that's what I wish my city could be like. That's what I wish my environment was like. And this is not just among science fiction sort of nerds. I've seen like policy people come across these images and share them on Twitter and be like, how can we do this? And they'll get lots of responses like, well, if you're the problem with this particular type of landscape is there'll be a bajillion mosquitoes, right? Or the problem is like, there's no guardrails on these like sky bridges that are everywhere and so forth. And I think that those are good objections, but they don't quite get at what is really appealing about these images. So this is, I think one of the most, if you Google Solarpunk or read articles that have about Solarpunk, of which there are just countless now. This is an image by an artist named Imperial Boy that I think often gets thrown out. And I would sort of show a couple other ones I think are some of my favorites. This is by Jessica Pearlstein. I think this is sort of a futuristic San Francisco based on the Transamerica building in the background, but I cannot quite tell what neighborhood this is in. Imagined neighborhood. And this is a piece for a contest by an artist named Arturo Gutierrez. And I've tried to source all the artists or sources for these, but some of the images I'm going to show are sort of floating creditless around the internet, and I was not able to do that. So please forgive me on that front. And so all of these, I think, display a few shared characteristics, and that we can use to sort of distinguish Solarpunk art from and kind of Solarpunk imaginings of urban life from just sort of like general sci-fi, utopian, ecotopian sort of futures that maybe have not thought through the human element quite so much. So, one, all of these are very verdant, right? They've got all this greenery, and it seems to be sort of greenery that's being actively engaged with and tended. Here it's a little further away, but it's not just the sort of trees on skyscrapers thing that I think we sometimes see in architectural designs that, from my understanding, is like not a very great place for trees to be. But nonetheless, it seems like people really want to find a way to have well cared for greenery around them, and especially if it's producing, in this case, it seems like it's producing flowers and maybe food. In this case, it seems like the city is really built around some of these sort of older trees that they're incorporated into the buildings, and the buildings share space with them. second, they're inhabited. Like all of these have people in them, and I think too often we see futuristic, designerly architectural renderings that just don't have any people. They don't look inhabited. They don't look like anyone lives there or uses that space. And or at best they have render ghosts. And I think that too often leads to us building spaces that actual humans don't really want to use. Giant, sort of very sort of modern, abstract, and in some ways beautiful, like corporate spaces, but ones in which people are not don't really spend time in, or aren't designed to have the proxemics, might be a word, or the comfort level, the vibe that people want to hang out in. And second, they're dense, right? There's just like a lot happening, and not just sort of dense in like we've got tall buildings with lots of people living in them, but dense in terms of like there's a lot of infill, right? People and buildings and residences are all close to each other. They're engaged with the natural environment. They're not just sort of planted on an abstract plane. Here sort of incorporates this waterway. This one is on a hill and then in the sort of mountainous region. There's no dead or hostile or kind of untended space. There's nothing here that feels like a parking lot, that feels like a median that on a roadway that's unclear what it's for, or if anyone can like hang out there. And they all have a sort of sense of verticality. And I'm going to sort of talk about this a little more, since verticality is the kind of thing that sounds nice in theory and in art, but can be really difficult to make happen in actual practice and city planning. But I think what people are really wanting when they sort of express an urge towards these images of a lot of verticality is they want space to be useful and used, and not have these large, very isolating patches that it doesn't seem like anyone can really, like humans are supposed to be there. And I think it also gets at the way in which, even living in very dense areas, if you're in a skyscraper like 50 stories up and that's where your apartment is, like that has an isolating effect. And because you look out and you're just far away from other people, right? I mean, you're close to other people in your building, but in terms of sort of the world outside your window. So these are, all things that are, I think we sort of we can understand the desire for, and then ask, like, can we create policies that make these possible? And last two, ornamentation. All of these have public beauty in them of one kind or another, and even if it's like graffiti on the wind turbines far away. And finally, they all feel to me more like retrofits than built out of sort of whole cloth, which I think is really important when we think about the futures that our sci-fi visuals inspire. That we aren't going to go out and build a lot of just brand new cities, right? Like we have cities, people live there. We have to transform these places where people are already living into the kinds of verdant spaces and that we want. So I'm going to sort of scroll through a few other things here. And this, I think, shows us a little bit of the contrast between kind of like the Solarpunk vision on the right here, and this kind of much more sort of Star Trek-y, far away kind of more generic sci-fi. And the one on the left has a lot of greenery and maybe has a lot of sort of sustainable practices implied by it, but there's I guess the philosophy of how the art is approached, I think is very different, right? You don't see any people, you're far away from the street level. Oh, and the other thing I meant to show here is, all of these, I think particularly this one and this one, they center renewable energy technology, right? It's right there, everywhere around them. And that's, I think a good, another sort of important visual component. So, here's another example of a piece of art that like centers solar panels, right? But I don't think this one has the Solarpunk vibe that we're talking about, right? This is like huge mega structure, and it doesn't feel identifiable. It doesn't feel like there are any people living here. Maybe we can sort of see buildings down here at the bottom, and there are a few people down there, but this feels much more like a kind of Coruscant Star Wars sort of Star Trek place, and not like the kind of thing that we can imagine plopping down in a city where people actually live right now. And then to sort of go back to verticality, I mean, these are some images that I think show some of the visual appeal, but the kind of implications of community, the way that there's connections across these buildings. On the left here, this is, I believe Macau. This is a real picture, and these two, I believe, are art, and they sort of get more science fictional as we go. And here, I mean, I think we can talk a little bit, and Clark, I'll just say you can jump in and cut me off whenever, because I have not timed myself on this. But here, I think we can see that a lot of the verticality comes from just the artist's prerogative to draw a really visually interesting image. But I think there's also a sense that of the usefulness and the usedness of the space that translates into what people want. And that then you get some of these things which are very interesting, but they don't feel like retrofits. They feel very far away from our sort of current situation, and they've got some trees on skyscrapers, and they've got some tiny little render figures, but it's unclear to me what is happening in these places. Like, what are they for? Like, why were they built, and what people are supposed to do in these buildings? And it reminds me a lot of images like this that sort of take curvature as a kind of futuristic aesthetic with its own value, regardless of how useful it actually is, right? I mean, how are you gonna like hang your paintings on these walls, right? And down at the bottom, we've just got the traditional lawn, right? And I think the lawn is something that there's not a ton of room for in Solarpunk, unless it's being actively laid down on. This is kind of, here we have the traditional suburban lawn, and then this is sort of the permaculture vision, right? And what I think is so appealing is the sense that people are actively engaged in this space, right? They don't go out and mow it once, or have the landscapers come and mow it like once every other week. This is something that you have to be in every day. They encourage you to be in every day. And too often I think our spaces are not designed for constant use, right? It's like so much of our space is dedicated to people parking their cars and leaving, right? So I've got some here that I don't have any major points to share, but I do really like. This one I think is interesting because it seems like there's sort of a solar rooftop above or some kind of container, and that feels kind of far away too, but it does seem to have make the trees on skyscrapers a little more plausible. This is a real place. This is outside London. It's a carbon neutral community, a sort of development suburb, and I think this has a lot of the elements already in the real world that we've been talking about. Here's more of this kind of density, and it's easy to see how density and verticality doesn't quite get you there, right? I mean, here on the left, you have something that could have been a steampunk, right? It could have been a sort of Victorian kind of like choked with diesel sort of vision, and even with the trains, and here we have something that implies a little more of a mindfulness about the land, and in multi-species inhabitants as well, I think, and working with the waterways and the landscape. And then you have places like this, right? This is from a video game that was called Solarpunk that I saw the trailer for and got a little frustrated with, because just no one, I can't imagine anyone spending actual time here, right? This is just abstract. It's and the point of the game was to creep through these spaces and shoot robots in the head. So not quite the same ethos. Some of them, I'm really on the fence about. I mean, this I think is really cool, but at the same time, it's hard for me to get a sense of what's happening here and how we connect this to our present day movements towards sustainability. Yeah, I mean, we have so much dead space, right? And even images like this, where I'm on the fence, there's very little of this kind of just dead space that happens. The medians that get mowed but are not cared for, that are poisoned by the fossil cars going by. This is from a newsletter put out by Christopher Brown, the sci-fi writer. It's an excellent Sunday morning read called Field Notes. And he goes and explores all these sort of cracked places that we've created in our landscape where things are trying to grow, but it's definitely a struggle. And so real quick, how do we get there? I think we get there through policies, and this is an example of a sort of policy-driven transformation of a street using techniques that were sort of offered by this. I'm blurred by a book called the Sprawl Repair Manual. And here are some of the sort of visuals in that book that show taking car-dominated sprawl and like doing the work to infill it, to start to make these mixed-use places that humans actually want to spend time in. And then maybe we can get to something that's kind of like this. I think this is still kind of fantastical, but this doesn't seem that fantastical to me. This feels very achievable, right? You've got sort of a less car-dominated street. You have people out and about using it. You have the greenery. It feels inhabited. It feels like there's habitats and multi-species, and it's got a sense of sort of pleasant proxemics and verticality, even though there are no sky bridges that people are sort of precariously about to fall off. So those are kind of some of the ideas I wanted to bring up and share, and hopefully stimulate some more of this conversation.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, if you want me to ever click back to any of these, I'm happy to do so.
That's really fantastic, and I think it really highlighted the importance of design as we think about what kinds of futures we're designing and for whom. And Malka Older has really, I think, thought more than anybody about the future design of democracy. as something we should also be considering in thinking about the future of the city. So Malka, please.
Yeah, thanks so much, Clark, and thanks to everybody else for these presentations, which are really exciting to look at in terms of the intentionality and the just variety of ideas that are coming out here. So I'm going to be pretty brief, and I just want to echo and emphasize a couple of things and build on some of the other points that have been brought up already. I want to take up some of the things that Clark said to start us off, which is these questions of how we tend to center technology looking at the future. And that's something that as a science fiction writer and as a sociologist, I really notice, because when I write stories, the stories have to be about people. Otherwise, they're almost certainly going to be really boring stories. I mean, some authors can pull this off, it's been done. But in general, if I'm reading a story, I want it to be about people who are acting like real people. And so it's very normal to me to have people and to think about how people interact with technologies. And yet, in so many of the depictions of the future that we see day to day, people are pretty much absent, or people are there in a single function as usually consumers, sometimes threats, sometimes victims, usually consumers. And so I think that really affects the way that we imagine our futures, because we see projections from technology companies about what their tech is going to be like. We see ideas about the future from economists. We see the forecasts for what the future is going to look like, whether it means the climate or whether it's the new kinds of technology that people think of. But again, unless we consider the way that humans interact with those technologies, that's a very limited view of the future, and really takes away from the potential of what we could do. Picking up on something that Clark said also, the traffic jams and the frustrations of our cities are not those are not inevitable natural consequences of the invention of the car. I am not a big fan of cars, and I am fine with not having them, but we have to recognize that the invention of the car by itself did not mean that we were going to end up with precisely the cities we have now. As we've seen brought up recently, again, the shape of the cities that we have now was very much determined by people deciding what neighborhoods could be sacrificed to let cars get from one place to another faster. What neighborhoods would be destroyed to build freeways. Those were decisions. Just like subsidizing gasoline, just like not building public transportation, just like all of these other decisions that were made, the laws that have to do with construction of housing and the parking spaces that must be attached, all of these decisions affect the way that cars are used and the ways that our cities are constructed. So it's really important that even when we do think of technology, we keep in mind that it's the ways that people apply that technology and the different incentives and the different pressures that push on different sides of design that give us the cities that we end up with. And of course, as someone who writes science fiction about democracy, I'm going to say not only is it the social aspect of technology, of material technology that we need to think about, we also need to think about social technology itself. Because one of the things that happens in cities, of course, is that people figure out new ways of interacting and dealing with having so many people in a small space, and how people can make decisions, and how people can live together, and how people can deal with all the different issues and opportunities that come with living in an urban area. So as a really committed pedestrian, I also wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the things that I appreciate about cities and would like to see in future cities, some of which echo a lot of what Andrew was saying. When I think about cities and what I value in them, and perhaps what other people value in them as well, because certainly if we look at the highest property prices, and the spaces that are considered the most desirable, a lot of these are the places that are dense and diverse. Because what does that density get us? The density gets us lots of different people and lots of different activities, really, in one place. If people are fascinated by the idea of living in New York or Paris or Tokyo, yeah, part of that has to do with this, the romanticism, the echo of this name that people have built up over centuries, blah, 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 blah. But if we set that aside, the reason this is exciting for young people or for older people or for anyone to go and live in one of these places is because you can walk down the street and see all sorts of unexpected things, because you can eat in a different restaurant every night, because you can go to a play or a movie or an outdoor show. And all of these things come from that density. They come from that diversity. However, that said, I think a lot of the analyses of this and a lot of people's expectations around cities mistake scale for density. So a lot of these focus on the idea that these are big, giant cities, as opposed to looking at the fact that when you live in a big, giant city, very often you really live in a neighborhood of it. And yes, you go to other neighborhoods sometimes, but typically that takes time and it's annoying, whether you're traveling by public transportation or by car. It's annoying. I mean, anyone, you all know this. If you go from one borough to another, not fun. Even in a smaller, medium-sized city, you're going to spend a lot of time in your neighborhood. And so when we talk, even when we talk about these big cities, we're really talking about subsets. We're talking about communities. We're talking about the area that you can go in a certain amount of time and with a certain amount of effort. And of course, that varies a lot, what that means, depending on whether the city is walkable or not, depending on whether it has public transportation or not, just what that radius is. But that if we think about that scale instead of the scale of the megacity, and we think about what density does in that, then that very much changes how we're thinking about the kinds of cities that have potential and the kinds of cities that are interesting to live in and that are exciting. So that's one thing that I wanted to point out. And then to move beyond that a little bit too, I'm reading a book right now, which is really fascinating, which I recommend to everyone, which is Annalee Newitz's new book, Four Lost Cities. And it's really apropos for this conversation because it's very much about how cities die, but also how they live before that. And in particular, the history of urbanization. And they write about the way that as people started moving into cities in the earliest days of urbanization, part of what made this such an interesting phenomenon was the shift for the first time of people connecting their identities to a place as opposed to a family group or a nomadic group that they traveled with. So a place as opposed to a group of people, which is something that obviously we still very much do. People still have, they identify themselves with the place they're from or the place they've chosen to live or the place they would like to live aspirationally. And that has a lot of meaning to people, and places become a sort of shorthand. Cities particularly become a sort of shorthand for the kind of people, the kind of identities that we want to claim for ourselves. However, that said, we are now entering a new phase, which is the digital world. And we're right now in a world that combines the digital and the urban. And so one of the interesting things to look at is how we can have some of these aspects of the city disassociated from place, something that I explore somewhat in my fiction. But if we consider that, we can live in very dense, exciting neighborhoods, but we can also live in very dense, exciting virtual spaces, and we can get some of the interaction and some of the art and some of the energy that way as well. That gives us yet another opportunity to change some of the values that we put on things that typically right now we use carbon and other regressive technologies to access. So I wanted to put those thoughts out there and look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thanks, Malka. Joey, I'm going to give you the privilege of the first question. So fire away. And for everybody else, if you have questions for the panelists, just stick them in the Q&A and we'll either do them live or people might answer you in the Q&A.
Thanks, Clark. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for those great presentations. Incredibly thought-provoking. So the question I wanted to start us with was, we have all of these, I think one touch point across all of your presentations is the need for sort of communities and people on the ground who know their geographies and their social geographies and their very close areas to be able to make decisions about energy futures and decarbonizing their cities, decarbonizing their communities. So as we move forward from these like really vivid stories and pieces of art and pieces of kind of architectural design fiction, how do we get from there to actual policy action? Like what kinds of structures and venues and arenas do we need to create to give communities a voice in decisions about the placement and design of urban energy systems and the design of their communities? And like, are there existing models currently in use, even on the micro scale, that might serve as a starting point? Yeah, just how do we get from these vivid imaginaries to actually moving things in this direction?
It's a great question. And it's something we're thinking a lot about, and we're undertaking with a project that we're working with Clark on, potentially for the city of Pittsburgh right now. So it's fresh for us, and it's a question that's with really layered answers. But you know, we're starting a process where we, for a project called Build Back Solar, where we want to work with stakeholders throughout the city of Pittsburgh or any other host city. Let's just say Pittsburgh for today. And you know what? It starts with conversations. That's where you start, is holding conversations. Now, of course, we're in COVID and this is all being done online, but that's not a bad thing, because oftentimes one of the challenges is bringing people to a venue. So how do you organize groups of people to be in the same room for a conversation? And actually right now, being able to do things online in this way, I think is going to open up a lot of opportunities.
As long as there's access to the online space. But
that's right.
Yeah, right now there's a big disconnect between the world of energy development and the world of community development. And so that gap has to be closed. And what that's going to take is zoning textual changes. It's going to take leadership at the city level and the neighborhood and the community development level. And it's going to take a kind of a new niche consultant class that's going to rise up over the next decade, that is going to be dedicated to the equitable design of community energy projects. And just as there are creative placemaking consultants now that help neighborhoods design new streetscapes, parks, and places for people that are engaging and beautiful, those same consultants or a new expanded version of that discipline will be helping communities co-design and lead their own transformation of their communities to be net zero carbon at a district-wide scale. Like Malka was saying, it's really and as scientific research is showing more and more, the interconnected microgrid of distributed energy is really where we can meet the sweet spot for resiliency, reliability, cost of energy, and equitable deployment. So I don't know exactly how that takes place in the policy space, but those are the things on our minds.
Yeah, I was looking for a chart to drop into the chat and I couldn't find it. I encountered it, on social media a couple of days ago, which makes it impossible to ever find again. But it was looking at actions that mayors could take to decarbonize their cities, and the number one action was land use policy and infill and densification. So it strikes me that it dovetails very nicely with all of the things that were presented today. That there's a lot of more high tech stuff that gets fetishized, but as you all have been saying, it's sort of more about people rethinking what the spaces that they're navigating every day look like and trying to figure out what values are bound up in those spaces and who gets to be there.
I'm sort of curious, Andrew, Malka, one of the things that I think is so powerful about fiction in this space is it allows ordinary people to enter into the conversation because not only are they, are these stories designed to be read and engaged with by everyone, but also, it engages people's own storytelling capabilities. We're storytelling creatures, and we all know how to tell stories. And so when you open up storytelling modalities, you get much broader, more inclusive participation. Do you know of, this idea of creative placemaking consultants? Are there people who are using science fiction to help communities tell different stories about what their futures might look like? Have you encountered things like that?
You mean besides CSI? You're doing that, right? I think that there's a renewed interest in maybe totally new interest in using science fiction and using storytelling for all sorts of things. I mean, with my books, I get things like people who work at law schools and want to use science fiction to teach law, but definitely with planning. And I think we're seeing that with design fiction a lot. There's this kind of blurry overlap space where people are saying we need to use narratives, whether it's scenario planning, whether it's design fiction, whether it's, all out people writing science fiction stories, which happens as well. And there's really interesting work being done in there. And I do think it's really powerful and important because, as everyone here has said, we need to be able to visualize the kinds of futures we want. We need to be intentional about this, but we need to also show how it can work. And again, a lot of the futures that are being visualized right now just take people and emotion out of it. And there's this idea that it's more objective and more realistic if, there's no emotions and it's all about the economics and the technology of it. And that's obviously not true, because hopefully people are going to exist in these futures. And if people exist there, people are going to be weird. People are going to be emotional. People are going to have human relations and act on those relations. And so unless we consider that, unless we take people into account as not just passive participants in these futures, but active agents of creating them and constantly recreating them, then we're going to have a lot of problems, and the actual futures we get to are not going to match up with those plans at all. So the more we can include narrative as another means of thinking about the futures that we want and the futures that we're designing, the better we'll be.
I think narratives, the ones especially that Malka and Andrew write, I can say get really precisely, I think, at issues of power differences and the importance of organizing and sort of like political blocks and diversity within subgroups. So you can have people who are environmentalists, but they have a lot of diverse opinions about tactics, or you can say, upper middle class people. And, I think we tend, when we're thinking about the future, to think demographically as if everybody's a sort of undifferentiated demographic block. But in reality, we have a lot of like fine-grained differences and sort of cultural variations, really micro level stuff that can cause pretty deep-seated conflicts and stories. And again, especially Malka's novels and short stories and Andrew's short stories, really, I think, get at those and get at the points that really rankle people politically in specific contexts, and where stuff that you don't see from the 1,000-foot view, just like in the images Andrew showed, become much more apparent on the street.
I'll just add that I think there's also just normative choices that we haven't settled on collectively that are not necessarily just a matter of coming from different perspectives, but just that there are different ways it can go that benefit different people and that lead to living different lives. And there was a question in the chat about have researchers discovered that fiction and changes behavior and makes people more environmental or what have you. And I think there has been, but for me, it feels very self-serving as like a creator of those kinds of works to sort of be touting that kind of research. For me, I try more to focus on how do we use these as tools to sort of prefigure the debates that we're going to have, right? A big one is with renewable energy is intermittency, right? Is this a problem? The problem that we don't have light all day and we don't have wind all day. And if those are sources of energy, we need to figure out how to have energy all day for people's comfort and for, you know, people's survival, right? They've got like dialysis machines and things like that. We can solve that with batteries if we're willing to accept the various sort of political, supply chain, environmental, sustainability challenges that come with that. We can solve it with other kinds of like large pieces of infrastructure, different kinds of sort of pump storage, kinetic storage, right? That require us to sort of collectively build and share big, you know, these large energy objects. You know, and they can be things that we deal with culturally, right? That we can solve intermittency culturally by deciding collectively that we're gonna you know, behave differently at night than we do during the day, right? And you know, we I think that it's easy to sort of from where we are now being like, oh yeah, we'll just get rid of we'll just have this energy transition. But there, you know, as Clark is always saying, there's lots of ways that can go in different people that benefits. And so you know, the science can only kind of flip so many coins ahead before it stops being science and starts just being speculation, right? But you know, those of us who play with speculation all the time, we can flip as many, you know, coins of potentiality as we want and get to a situation that's really interesting and that highlights some possibility and facet of the world that might come into being that we need to be thinking about, like, the sooner the better. So yeah, and I see another good question in the chat. I'll sort of leave that up to the group.
Very, very quickly, just to add on to Andrew's response about the effect of reading fiction, and I don't know the effect of necessarily being exposed to the architectural design fiction type work, but there's been recent work on climate fiction narratives, so stories about the climate crisis and human responses, and it tends to show that climate fiction doesn't change people's mind. It doesn't take someone who's a climate denier and flip them to the other side. It doesn't have a permanent effect. It has an effect that decays over time. So you read some climate fiction, you tend to, you know, in various ways react to it, either emotionally or sometimes behaviorally. You talk more about climate for a period of time, a few months is often what's reported. And then also the thing that is really great is that it increases the salience. So like, you know, political identities are like bundles of issue positions, you know, in one view. And so like, you know, if you care a lot about gun control and land use and whatever else, election reform, but you also care about the climate crisis, reading climate fiction might bump the climate crisis up and make you more attentive to it in the next election cycle or something like that. So there is a kind of like salience. Clark has used the word sensitization, that it sensitizes people to the nuances of these issues and sparks curiosity. So there are empirical effects, but they're not a silver bullet. You don't just dose someone with a story and flip them over, unfortunately, maybe, or fortunately, I don't know.
I think it's a lot about wrapped up in language, because when we use words like fiction and speculative, it makes it feel very soft, but someone working in a more scientific field would use terms like modeling. But in a way, those are both types of world building, and how else can we influence the path that culture is taking in the near future without speculation and imagination and fiction? I mean, you have to have these things.
In fact, often when we're presenting, I edge away from words like the future, because I want people to be in the now with these ideas. And I edge away from art because design is taken a little bit more seriously in the world than art. And, you know, there's ways in which we're always shifting our language to get people to understand an immediacy and a need.
Yeah, and I guess I'll while we have the mute off, I'll just nod to this next question and say that no, we have to reach some sort of steady state with Earth systems that is incompatible with an infinite growth model of capitalism. But that's where imagination is going to be really important, because we have to build those models We have to allow people to put themselves in a future that's beyond the current model of capitalism. It doesn't have to be not capitalism. It has to be some form that's more in harmony with natural systems, and we can do that. But it's going to take a kind of imagination and speculation and world building, so that people can live within those scenarios and see how preferable that would be than the situation we find ourselves in today.
It's interesting. You keep using this word world building, and you know, it's a word that we use a lot in kind of talking about the kind of work that Joey and Ruth and Ed have been leading at CSI. And of course, it is something that everybody does when they talk about the future, whether they do it explicitly or implicitly. And you know, I'm recalled of my favorite sort of example of world building without world building, which is a report that the National Academies did about a decade ago called America's Energy Future, which built absolutely zero picture of what America or the future would look like in the report. It was an enormous tome in which they eschewed kind of all questions of at least in an explicit sense, asking what that future was going to look like. And so you know, there's a way in which that was a kind of explicit decision to try to not get engaged in a set of conversations about the politics of the different worlds that might get built. And so I guess I'm curious how you think about how we kind of think about the politics of this transition in thinking about stories, in thinking about world building, in thinking about kind of the future. And maybe Malk, I'll ask you to think a little bit about that out loud. You know, in part because I think, you know, like information technology, energy has been at the center of our political dialogues for a really, really long time. And I do think that like information technology, it's kind of a space in which politics is getting done at the moment, even if it's just implicitly, but also which raises interesting questions about what the future of politics might look like.
Well, I think that's, you know, it is a really fundamental, you know, a real crux of the things that we are fighting about in politics right now, because like information technologies, energy it's a public good. It's a thing that has all kinds of externalities. It's a thing that underlies so much of what we do, that there's all these elements of society and technology and commerce and economy that are built on top of it. And so fundamentally, you know, it's really closely linked to what we think the state or governments, maybe we should move on into this future where we no longer are talking about the state, but are talking about whatever government or organizing principle we have. It's really about that, because, you know, what do we organize ourselves for if not to find these synergies and these economies of scale and these roles of facilitation that individuals can't do, that we need to do together. And so I think, you know, that's why it really becomes this battleground, because there are a lot of people who don't want that to be happening, who want to be, you know, they want to be hoarding and working from an individual perspective to not be sharing. And yet we know that we can do so much better if it is a collaborative thing, if it's a thing that we share and have the give and take of the microgrids that we were talking about. And so, yeah, I think it's a really fundamental thing of us making that switch and saying we are in this together. And then from there, figuring out what is the best way to do that. What is the right scale at which we talk about that for various different things. Whether it's that there's sort of a baseline, this is the worst possible level of energy expenditure you can have, that's a big umbrella, and then below that people figure out their own ways to get to the goals that they need to get to on a very small scale, and how that's organized and how people are engaged. But yes, I think it's one of the fundamental things that we are arguing about in political science, philosophy, and economy today.
Sorry, Eric asks a really interesting question about whether there are promising examples of communities that are prototyping post-carbon societies in interesting ways.
I mean, I'll say
ahead,
that,
Andrew.
Yeah, there definitely are. But I try not to like put too much emphasis on those as like, this is all we have to do is copy this, right? Because it's got kind of a sort of Thoreau sort of at Walden Pond kind of vibe, right? Where where you can, too much of the work of becoming post-carbon in those kinds of small experiments is about sort of isolating yourself from a bigger system, right? And also about sort of ignoring the ways in which you're all hyper dependent on that bigger system, right? Thoreau famously like had his wife do like half the work for him, and like had to still go and get materials, and was like a mile out of town. So I think, and I remember I had a really interesting conversation with some Swedish anarchists a few years ago who were sort of trying to do this on sort of houseboats that they were building, where they could grow their own food and they could move around. They had their own energy supply and could filter their own water. And it sounded really great. And then they said, yeah, we think we're really onto something. It's too bad Americans could never do this, because if you got sick, you couldn't go to the doctor. If you're just, sort of like, in order to go to the doctor, you have to have a job, right? Because you have to either be making enough money to pay for insurance or the doctor, or get it through your employer in America, right? So, there are all kinds of ways in which the broader system enables these kinds of utopian or sort of prefigurative experiments. And I think we have to talk about those sort of big changes, shifts of funding and capital, and changes to sort of people's lives in general that enable the experimentation that we're talking about here.
Part of the Logi 2020 design challenge is centered around this beautiful 3,800 acres of land in rural northern Nevada, a few miles as the bird flies from the Black Rock City event Bureau of Land Management land. That used to take place every August and may happen this year again, but no one's sure yet. But what's interesting about this 3,800 acres is, and if you'd like to learn more, go to logi2020flyranch.org. The design brief there sort of frames this. I don't know if it's really in the tradition of Arcosanti or Oneida, but and we'll see how this unfolds. But the challenge really was to take this off-grid land and through 5 primary systems of energy, water, food, shelter, and regeneration of waste flows, artfully design these infrastructures so that they complement each other and are greater than some of their parts, work as a system in concert with the landscape and in concert with the beauty of the environment.
Also in very defined spaces. So 3,800 acres was not open to the teams to just do what they wanted. We spent a year and a half really defining conservation areas and go zones and those that are sort of ecotone, sort of on the edge of conservation and go zones. And we're going to start prototyping this summer. So it's a harsh climate, every season unique and intense. So we'll be prototyping 10 or more of the design outcomes this summer with the hope to begin development at a larger scale next year after we've tested these systems throughout multiple seasons.
And it's an interesting, the results that came in that you can see are a mix between low tech and high tech. And so it's interesting to see how the successful future may be that kind of learning from the past at the same time that we incorporate all of what we know now, and to that could be a really great result. So it's not just about hyper techno optimism, it's also about, we've been zero carbon before, just go back 150 years, but it's not about sacrificing our contemporary way of life. It's about learning, taking pieces from those lessons of the past and incorporating them into the future.
I think the history of like utopian storytelling in the West anyway, which and there's especially hot period around 1900. There's a tendency to create these like overarching, like you can drop this utopia anywhere and it'll work anywhere. And working in fiction anyway around climate and around energy with Clark and these folks has really helped me understand that like with energy, you need to be thinking really locally, and it needs to be really bespoke for the geography and the social geography. Chris Gearhart, who works at the National Renewable Energy Lab, wrote an essay for our Cities of Light book where he talks about the customization of energy futures and how solar is uniquely flexible. It scales well up and down. And so you can imagine a lot of different arrangements that are sensitive to the needs of specific communities, and perhaps solar won't be the best everywhere. You'll need a mix. But I think that like the utopian mode is actually kind of in tension in some ways with effective climate action, effective energy design, in that it tends to be fairly totalizing and fixes a kind of in-group and reifies it as like everyone or sort of the natural state of things. And, I'm talking more about like the stuff I'm more familiar with, which is like early 20th century and even mid 20th century. Huxley writes this kind of Buddhist utopia called Island. A lot of them take place on islands too, which tells you something. It's like you need this bounded space that not everybody has access to, that's a bit cut off. And so I think there's some kind of, I don't know, infrastructure within utopian thinking that makes it like we have to rethink the way that we're using that strategically because of the assumptions that are bundled up in it sometimes.
Interesting to think about the tensions between this world that we've built, and we've all seen the consequences in the last year, in which we are embedded in these enormous, gigantic systems. And when those systems get disrupted, as they have with supply chains for toilet paper, for example, over the last year, for other kinds of services, we saw pictures of people dumping milk because you couldn't get it from the dairy to the places where people needed it. We've seen these disruptions of these systems. We've seen the collapse of the global financial systems in 2008 and the consequences that then flowed for everybody. So I think there's a lot of sense for people that these systems have become too big to fail, in some sense, that's worrisome. It raises problematic concerns, both for the vulnerabilities it creates, and also, of course, because these totalizing systems then also become totalizing in other ways, Google and Facebook collect massive amounts of data about us, et cetera. And so in that, we see all of these impulses to try to isolate yourself, to try to pull away from these. We're working with 4 communities in rural Puerto Rico where they didn't have electricity for a year. And now what they want to do, even though they've been reconnected to the grid, is to figure out how to build solar initiatives within their communities so that they're not dependent on this enormous outside infrastructure for the future of their energy supplies, right? So there's this tension between this world that we've built and this world that in which people see greater security and greater resilience in finding ways to disconnect or at least to insulate themselves against some of these larger phenomena. And so I guess I'm curious how you all are kind of thinking about this in the context of the sort of the future of energy. I mean, you know, people talk about solar energy as a distributed resource, but then 90% of the world's solar panels get manufactured by a small number of companies in a very isolated geography of the world, right? And so you have this giant supply chain that kind of feeds into that. And that's when solar is at 1% of the world's energy. I can only imagine what that manufacturing system looks like when solar is 50% of the world's energy. So how do we balance these how do we think about these tensions, this question of these large systems versus our ability to create customization, to create some sense of security and insulation from the kind of reverberations of these systems, et cetera, going forward?
You know, I think this really is connected to the question in the chat about independence versus interdependence. And, you know, I mean, I've been thinking a lot lately about how independence and freedom are deeply like collectively constructed phenomenon, right? That like the notion that a car gives you independence is you know, built on top of an enormous public project to create roads all over the country and the planet, and to create gas stations that you can stop at when you run out of gas, right? And so, you know, if we want to, we can use these transformations to give ourselves new kinds of freedom, right? That are, you know, not freedom, not always freedom sort of from the larger system, but are freedom created by the larger system, right? And you know, one of the first ideas in Solarpunk that really grabbed me in the sort of early discussions around this back in 2015 was infrastructure is a form of resistance to and you know, maybe to all kinds of shocks, right? To predations of actors that are trying to sort of compromise your community's self-determinacy, and you know, the more that we can build the kinds of collective freedoms and infrastructural freedoms now, the more empowered we'll all be to, I guess, sort of push back against the worst uses and sort of exploitations that may come embedded in any sort of future shift.
I just want to add another dimension to this critique of utopianism as well, which is it's not just the totalitarianism and the sort of centralization of it, it's also that it's static. You know, all of these, they're conceptions that say we get to this point and then we're done, and we just hold it there in this utopian thing, and that is never ever the way that anything works. Everything changes constantly, and we need to be thinking about systems as evolving, as processes, as constantly being reinvented. And I think that that's also part of the answer to this, although, I do think that all these questions of scale and interdependence are really, really important. There is this other thing of reinvention. And as long as we keep the power for reinvention in the right place and also balance the need for stability, because there is, again, a tension there. It's not that we can just remake things every second, but we have to be aware that things are changing and that nothing is ever going to be the answer that lasts. So as well as a spatial scale, jurisdictional sort of balance between independence and interdependence, there's a temporal one as well.
Well, and
Yeah,
all of these small utopian communities, like, they have trouble over time, and they'll tell you that at Arcosanti if you go there and talk to them. Like, they've had huge power struggles, and it has to do with generational conflict, really, and then older residents, newer residents, and dealing with the inflow and outflow of people. I think that's like, it's tricky even at the scale they've been working at, which is a few dozen people.
Yeah, really interesting. I've heard people say recently that even if we achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, that the energy system that we have in 2050 is not the one that we will have in 2100. And so this sense that we're not, as in some sense we have, replacing our current energy systems, which in some ways have lasted for a century or a century and a half, with a new one for 2050 and beyond, but rather with a kind of constancy of evolution and change as we move forward. And presumably there's a social element to that too, given that these systems are socio-technical, and also then, an interesting feature of the stories that we've been telling in these projects, like the cities of light, is that those stories are they're snapshots in time. And so it's hard in those stories to convey this dynamism and this evolution and this, that things are evolving. I actually really like that about the Sentinel cycle, Malka, that infomocracy is not a static thing. In there, it's a constantly evolving dynamic to try to figure out what this next stage of the evolution of democracy is. And it'd be really helpful for us to think about our energy transitions in that same kind of way, of how do we create a kind of managed process of ongoing change and transition. Thank you all so much. This has been a really remarkable conversation. Any last thoughts from any of you in our last couple of minutes?
I was thinking about this idea of how solar energy and other renewables as a democratizing force. If we have this opportunity to create the kind of equitable infrastructure that can provide that freedom for human thriving, that can be a countervailing force against tendencies towards one deciding their own sovereign or being the rugged individual who doesn't need society. That's a very American tradition, but it comes as a consequence of failure of social structures and institutions. And if we have the opportunity now to create these really robust, equitable, democratic institutions, very much so on the framework of our new energy infrastructure. And so that's a really exciting thing for us to think about, and hopefully can steer us more towards collective social working together rather than ripping apart.
Great. Well, I think that's a really nice place to end the conversation. Thank you, Malka. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Elizabeth and Robert. Thank you, Joey. Been great to see you all this morning, and I will look forward to future conversations. Take care, everybody.